The chandeliers of the Winterbrook Grand Ballroom threw soft gold light across 300 guests, dressed in silk and pressed linen, the air thick with orchids and the low murmur of a string quartet warming up in the corner, and Naomi Kapoor stood frozen just inside the entrance, her hand still resting on the heavy brass door handle, feeling 9 years collapse into a single, suffocating breath. She had rehearsed this moment in her head 100 times during the drive from the airport, had told herself she was ready, that she was 32 years old and had built an entire life without needing a single person in this room to validate it. And then her mother appeared, gliding across the marble floor in a shimmering emerald gown, her smile arriving a full second before her eyes did, cold and polished and utterly rehearsed, and she said loud enough for the nearest cluster of relatives to hear every word. "Well, I hope you're only here to congratulate your sister, and not to embarrass this family again." The words landed like a dropped glass, sharp and unmistakable, and for one terrible moment the entire room seemed to still, conversations faltering mid-sentence, heads turning with the particular hunger people reserve for watching someone else's humiliation unfold in real time. Naomi felt the old, familiar heat climb up the back of her neck, the same helpless anger she'd carried out of this family's house 9 years earlier. And for just a heartbeat, she considered turning around, walking back out through those heavy brass doors, letting her mother win the only way her mother had ever known how to fight, by making Naomi disappear before she could speak. But then she caught sight of Priya across the room, radiant in white lace, frozen mid-laugh with her bridesmaids, her eyes finding Naomi's with a flicker of alarm and something else, something like hope. And Naomi remembered, suddenly and completely, why she had gotten on that plane in the first place. Not for her mother, not even for herself, not really. For the sister who had never once stopped calling her, texting her, loving her, even when loving her had meant defying the only two people in the world who had ever told Priya what love was supposed to look like. Naomi straightened her shoulders, met her mother's cold, polished smile with a calm she did not entirely feel, and said evenly, "I'm here for Priya. That's all I've ever been here for." She walked past her mother into the ballroom, and though the whispers followed her like a current beneath the surface of the party, she held her head level, because 9 years of building a life from nothing had taught her exactly how to walk through a room full of people who expected her to fall apart. To understand how Naomi Kapoor came to be standing in that ballroom, cold-shouldered by her own mother in front of 300 wedding guests, you would have to go back nearly a quarter of a century, to a house on Larkspur Avenue where medicine wasn't simply a career choice but a kind of inherited religion, passed down through 3 generations of Kapoors, with the same unquestioned certainty as a family name. Naomi's grandfather had been a respected cardiologist in Mumbai before immigrating to the United States, building a small but reputable practice from nothing. And by the time Naomi was born, that single act of ambition had calcified into a family expectation so absolute it was rarely even spoken aloud. Simply assumed, the way you assume the sun will rise. Her father, Dr. Vikram Kapoor, had followed his own father into cardiology, eventually becoming chief of cardiac surgery at the regional medical center. Her mother, Dr. Meera Kapoor, had built an equally distinguished career in oncology, and between them, they had raised their 3 children with a single unwavering North Star. The Kapoor family produced doctors, and doctors alone. Naomi's older brother, Ansh, had never once questioned this trajectory, moving through pre-med, medical school, and a competitive surgical residency with the kind of effortless compliance that made him his parents' obvious favorite, the golden proof that their model of parenting worked exactly as intended. Priya, 4 years younger than Naomi, had absorbed the same expectations from the cradle, though with considerably more private anxiety than Ansh ever seemed to carry. A quiet, watchful child who learned early that approval in the Kapoor household was a currency dispensed only for the correct achievements. Naomi, born squarely between them, had spent much of her childhood as the quiet anomaly nobody quite knew what to do with. From the time she was 7 years old, she had been utterly, helplessly obsessed with buildings, with the way light moved through a well-designed room, with the elegant logic of load-bearing walls and cantilevered roof lines. She filled notebook after notebook with sketches of houses that didn't exist, elaborate structures with curved staircases and floor-to-ceiling windows, and where other children her age were memorizing the names of bones and organs at their parents' insistence, Naomi was quietly teaching herself, from library books checked out under her own name, the basic principles of architectural drafting. Her parents treated this fascination, for most of her childhood, as an amusing but ultimately irrelevant hobby, the kind of quirky interest that would naturally give way, they assumed, to the family's true calling once she grew old enough to understand what mattered. "You can design your own house someday," her father would say indulgently when she showed him her latest sketch, "after you finish your residency." It never seemed to occur to him, not once during all those years, that Naomi meant something entirely different by her drawings than a hobby to be indulged and eventually outgrown. The reckoning came, as these things often do, gradually and then all at once, during Naomi's senior year of high school, when the conversation about college applications could no longer be postponed, with vague reassurances about figuring it out later. Naomi sat her parents down one evening at the kitchen table, her palms sweating, a folder of architecture program brochures clutched in her hands, and told them, as steadily as she could manage, that she wanted to study architecture, not biology, not pre-med architecture, at a program 3 states away that had one of the best design schools in the country. The silence that followed stretched long enough that Naomi began to hope, foolishly, that her parents were simply processing, that they might come around given a little time. Instead, her father set down his fork with a controlled, deliberate precision that Naomi would recognize for years afterward as the specific quality of his anger, the kind that never raised its voice because it didn't need to. "You're joking," he said. "I'm not," Naomi said. "I've thought about this for years, Dad. I don't want to be a doctor. I want to design buildings. I'm good at it. I've been good at it since I was a kid, and you both always just—" "You've been good at a hobby," her mother interrupted, her voice tight and clipped. "Naomi, this family has produced physicians for 3 generations. Your grandfather built this family's name from nothing in a country that didn't want him here. Your father saved lives every single day of his career. This isn't about whether you're good at drawing houses. This is about honoring what this family has built, what it stands for. I'm not trying to dishonor anything," Naomi said, her voice rising despite her best efforts to keep it steady. "I just don't want to spend my entire life doing something I don't love just because it's what everyone else in this family did. Ansh loves medicine. That's great. That's his path. This is mine." The argument that followed lasted well past midnight, circling the same exhausted ground again and again, her parents alternating between cold logic about financial security and reputation and increasingly raw appeals to family loyalty, legacy, sacrifice. Naomi held her ground through sheer stubborn will, though by the end of that first terrible night, she understood with a sinking certainty that this wasn't a disagreement that would simply blow over with time. Something fundamental had cracked open between her and her parents, and no amount of reasonable explanation on her part seemed capable of closing it back up. The following months brought an escalating campaign of pressure that Naomi would later recognize with the clarity of hindsight as a kind of desperate control masquerading as concern. Her parents arranged informational meetings with family friends who were doctors, hoping their enthusiasm might rekindle some latent interest in medicine. They subtly discouraged her from attending information sessions at architecture programs, once even forgetting to pass along an acceptance letter that arrived while Naomi was away at a summer program. A lapse Naomi only discovered was deliberate years later, during a conversation with her mother that neither of them fully recovered from. They enlisted Ansh, freshly accepted into medical school himself and eager to please, to have big brother talks with Naomi about the practical realities of an artistic career, conversations that felt, even at the time, less like brotherly concern and more like a scripted extension of their parents' campaign. Naomi held firm through all of it, applying to architecture programs anyway, using financial aid forms and a modest scholarship she'd secured independently to fund her application fees when her parents refused to cover them. When her acceptance letter finally arrived, official and undeniable, from a well-regarded architecture program in a city several states away, she brought it to the dinner table with a strange mixture of pride and dread, hoping against her better judgment that her parents might finally, faced with the concrete reality of her achievement, find some way to be happy for her. Instead, that dinner became the breaking point that would define the next 9 years of her life. And "If you go to that school," her father said, his voice flat and final in a way that made Naomi's stomach drop before he even finished the sentence, "you go alone. We will not pay for it. We will not support it." And frankly, Naomi, I don't know how we explain to this family, to our community, that our daughter walked away from everything we built to go draw pictures of buildings for a living. "Dad," Naomi said, her voice cracking despite her best efforts, "please. This is what I want. This is what makes me happy. Isn't that supposed to matter to you?" "What matters?" her mother said, cutting in with a coldness that Naomi would replay in her mind for years afterward, trying and failing to reconcile it with the woman who had once, however imperfectly, tucked her into bed and kissed her forehead every single night of her childhood. Is that this family does not raise quitters, and it does not raise children who throw away everything 3 generations built because of some childish fascination with drawing houses. If you choose this path, you choose it without us. I mean that, Naomi. Without us. The words hung in the air with a terrible, unmovable weight, and Naomi understood, sitting there at the same kitchen table where she'd once shown her father crayon sketches of imaginary houses, that her parents meant every syllable. She looked to Ansh, hoping for some flicker of support, and found only an uncomfortable downward gaze, his loyalty to their parents' vision of the family evidently outweighing whatever affection he held for his sister's dreams. She looked to Priya, only 14 at the time, and saw in her younger sister's wide, frightened eyes something that looked almost like an apology, though Priya said nothing at all that night, too young and too afraid to challenge the wall of certainty their parents had built around the dinner table. Naomi left 3 weeks later, on a gray September morning, with 2 suitcases packed with clothes, her architecture sketchbooks, and a modest amount of savings she'd accumulated from a part-time job at a local drafting firm the previous summer, a job she had taken specifically against her parents' wishes. Her mother did not come downstairs to say goodbye. Her father stood in the doorway of his study, arms crossed, and said only, "I hope this is worth what you're giving up," before turning back to his desk without another word. Priya, defying whatever instructions she'd been given, slipped out to the driveway just as Naomi was loading her suitcases into her second-hand car, threw her arms around her sister's neck, and whispered fiercely, "I don't care what they say. I'm still going to call you. I promise." That promise, made by a frightened 14-year-old in a driveway on a gray September morning, would prove to be the single unbroken thread connecting Naomi to the family that had otherwise cast her out completely. The years that followed tested every reserve of resilience Naomi possessed. She arrived in her new city with barely enough savings to cover 2 months of a shared apartment with 3 other students, and she quickly discovered that architecture school, demanding under the best of circumstances, was a brutal gauntlet for a student working 2 part-time jobs simply to stay afloat financially. She waited tables most evenings at a busy downtown restaurant, worked weekend shifts at a hardware store that at least connected loosely to her field of study, and spent whatever hours remained hunched over drafting tables and studio projects, running on a punishing combination of coffee, stubbornness, and the quiet, private certainty that she had made the right choice, whatever it cost her. There were nights, more of them than she ever admitted to anyone, when the exhaustion and isolation nearly broke her. She missed her family with an ache that never fully dulled, even as the specific memory of her mother's cold voice at that final dinner kept her from picking up the phone to call home. She watched classmates receive care packages and tuition support from parents who believed in their creative ambitions, and she felt, in those moments, a loneliness so total it frightened her. It was during her second year, in the depths of a particularly brutal studio project that had her surviving on almost no sleep for nearly a week, that Naomi met the person who would become the single most important professional influence of her early career, Professor Elena Vasquez, a sharp, exacting architecture instructor with a formidable reputation and, as Naomi would discover, a similarly unconventional path into the field herself. Elena noticed something in Naomi's work during a particularly grueling review session, a raw talent for spatial reasoning combined with an emotional sensitivity to how people actually lived inside the building she designed, qualities Elena insisted were far rarer and more valuable than pure technical polish. She began mentoring Naomi more directly, staying late after studio hours to work through design problems, connecting her with a summer internship at a respected local firm, and perhaps most importantly, offering the kind of steady, unconditional belief in Naomi's abilities that had been so conspicuously absent from her own family for years. "Talent without support just burns out faster," Elena told her once, during a late evening in the studio when Naomi, exhausted and discouraged after a particularly harsh critique from a visiting juror, had confessed to wondering whether she'd made a terrible mistake walking away from her family's expectations. "You've got the talent. What you need is someone in your corner reminding you that the hard days don't mean you chose wrong. They just mean you're doing something difficult and worthwhile. Those 2 things aren't the same, even though they feel identical at 2 in the morning." Elena's mentorship carried Naomi through the remainder of architecture school and into her early career, and though the 2 women eventually developed a friendship independent of the formal mentor relationship, Naomi never forgot the specific debt she owed to a professor who had chosen to invest in her at exactly the moment her own family had chosen to walk away. Throughout these difficult years, Priya remained faithfully, quietly present, calling every week without fail, sometimes for only a few stolen minutes from behind a locked bathroom door when their parents were within earshot, sometimes for longer conversations when she could manage genuine privacy. She never openly rebelled against their parents' decision to disown Naomi, understanding with a pragmatism beyond her years that direct confrontation would only cost her whatever access she still had to her older sister. Instead, she maintained the relationship through careful discretion, a covert loyalty that deepened over the years into something Naomi came to treasure as one of the few unbroken threads connecting her to the family she'd otherwise lost. Priya's calls carried Naomi through her most difficult financial years, through failed early client projects and the particular loneliness of major holidays spent with friends' families rather than her own, through the quiet, grinding uncertainty of building a career from absolute scratch with no safety net beneath her. And in turn, Naomi became something of a confidential sounding board for Priya as well, particularly as Priya grew older and began quietly questioning the same rigid expectations that had originally driven Naomi away. Though Priya, perhaps having learned from watching her sister's exile, chose a different strategy entirely. Rather than open rebellion, she pursued her medical studies dutifully enough to keep the peace at home, while privately developing an interest in medical research and public health policy that fell somewhat outside the narrow surgical and clinical specialties her parents had always envisioned. A compromise that let her carve out a version of her own identity without triggering the same complete rupture Naomi had experienced. "I don't know how you did it," Priya told Naomi during one particularly long phone call in Naomi's fourth year of independence. Naomi by then working her first junior position at a mid-sized architecture firm while still moonlighting occasional weekend shifts at a coffee shop to cover the gap between her modest salary and the cost of city living. Just walking away from everything. "I think about it sometimes, and I get so scared I can't even breathe." "It wasn't brave, not really," Naomi told her honestly. "It was just the only choice that let me keep being myself. I didn't walk away because I was strong. I walked away because staying would have meant disappearing into something that wasn't me. That's not the same as courage. That's just self-preservation." "Still," Priya said quietly, "I don't think I could do it." "You don't have to do it exactly the way I did," Naomi told her. "You're allowed to build your own version of this. Just don't let their expectations become the only voice in your head. That's all I'd ask of you." These conversations, accumulated over years of stolen phone calls and secret visits during Priya's college breaks, became the quiet foundation of a relationship that would eventually reshape the entire family's future in ways none of them could have predicted during that terrible dinner 9 years earlier. Naomi's career, meanwhile, began its slow, steady ascent through a combination of relentless work ethic, genuine talent, and the kind of quiet integrity that eventually earns its own reputation in any competitive field. After several years at the mid-sized firm where she'd cut her teeth on junior projects, she was recruited by a boutique architecture practice known for innovative, sustainable residential design. And it was there, over the following 4 years, that Naomi truly began to distinguish herself. She developed a particular specialty in adaptive reuse projects, transforming aging industrial buildings and neglected historic structures into striking, functional living spaces, work that combined her early childhood fascination with buildings and light with a growing passion for sustainable design and community-conscious architecture. Her projects began attracting attention first within local design circles, then in regional publications, and eventually following a particularly striking adaptive reuse project that transformed a derelict textile mill into award-winning mixed-income housing in National Architecture Press. By the time she turned 30, Naomi had left the boutique firm to launch her own independent practice, a decision that terrified her privately even as she projected calm confidence to the small team she began assembling around her. The early months of running her own firm brought their own fresh anxieties, client acquisition, cash flow management, the particular vulnerability of putting her own name and reputation directly on the line rather than sheltering within a larger firm's established brand. But the same stubborn determination that had carried her out of her parents' house 9 years earlier carried her through this new chapter as well. And within 2 years, Naomi Kapoor Architecture had built a genuinely respected regional reputation, securing increasingly prestigious commissions, and eventually, a feature profile in a well-regarded national design magazine that cemented her standing among a new generation of architects reshaping how American cities approach sustainable urban housing. Throughout this ascent, Naomi never once reached out to her parents seeking reconciliation, and never once used her growing success as leverage to prove them wrong. This was a deliberate choice, one she discussed at length during a particularly reflective conversation with Elena, her former mentor turned close friend, during a dinner celebrating the opening of Naomi's third completed project under her own firm's name. Part of me used to imagine sending my parents a copy of every article written about my work, Naomi admitted over wine that evening, just to prove I'd made it without them. But somewhere along the way, that stopped feeling like the point. I didn't build this life to win an argument with them. I built it because it's genuinely who I am. If I spent it all trying to prove something to people who aren't even watching, I'd just be trading one version of living for someone else's approval for another. That's the real victory, Elena said, raising her glass. Not the buildings, not the magazine features, the fact that you stopped needing them to see it at all. Naomi carried that hard-won piece into every subsequent year of her career, building not just a professional reputation but a genuinely fulfilling personal life alongside it. Close friendships forged through years of shared struggle and eventual shared success. A warm, easy partnership with a documentary filmmaker named Julian she'd met through a mutual friend 3 years into running her own firm. A life that, whatever its early hardships, had become entirely, unmistakably her own. And then 9 years after that gray September morning, when she'd loaded 2 suitcases into a second-hand car while her father watched coldly from a doorway, the wedding invitation arrived. It came in the mail on an otherwise ordinary Tuesday, a heavy cream envelope with elegant calligraphy addressing it to Naomi Kapoor, the return address listing her parents' house on Larkspur Avenue, and inside a formal wedding invitation announcing the marriage of Priya Kapoor to Dr. Rajiv Malhotra, along with a handwritten note tucked into the envelope in the Priya's unmistakable looping script. Please come. I need you there. I don't care what anyone else says. This is my day, and you belong in it. Love, always, P. Naomi sat with that invitation for 3 full days before deciding, turning it over in her hands during quiet evenings on her apartment balcony, discussing it at length with Julian, who listened with the patient, steady presence that had become one of the great gifts of their relationship, and finally with Elena, whose advice, as always, cut straight to the heart of the matter. The question isn't whether your parents deserve to see you there, Elena told her over coffee. The question is whether Priya deserves to have you there. Those are 2 completely separate things, and you already know the answer to the second one. Naomi called Priya that evening, her voice steady despite the complicated tangle of emotions churning beneath the surface. I'll be there, she said simply. For you, not for them. That's all I ever wanted, Priya said, her voice catching audibly with relief. I know it's going to be hard. I know Mom's going to be Mom. But I need my sister there when I marry the person I love. You're the only one who ever taught me that was allowed to matter. And so, 9 years after leaving her family's house with 2 suitcases and a shattered sense of belonging, Naomi Kapoor found herself standing once again in her mother's orbit, this time in the entrance of the Winterbrook Grand Ballroom, absorbing her mother's cold, rehearsed greeting in front of 300 watching guests, and choosing, in that single defining moment, to walk forward anyway. The remainder of that evening unfolded with the particular tension of a family drama playing out in front of an audience too polite to openly acknowledge what everyone privately understood. Naomi took her assigned seat at a table populated largely by extended relatives she hadn't seen in nearly a decade, and the reactions around her ranged across a wide and uncomfortable spectrum. Her Aunt Divya, always the more sympathetic of her father's siblings, squeezed her hand warmly under the table and murmured, "It's good to see you, Beta. Truly." Her cousin Rohan, only 12 the last time Naomi had seen him, and now a gangly 19-year-old, stared at her with undisguised curiosity, clearly having absorbed some heavily edited version of the family's history that painted Naomi as a cautionary tale rather than a person. Others simply avoided eye contact entirely, the particular social discomfort of not knowing quite how to acknowledge a family scandal seated politely at their dinner table. Her father, seated at the head table beside his wife and both his other children, offered Naomi only the barest acknowledgement throughout the early part of the evening, a stiff nod when their eyes happened to meet across the room, nothing more. It was, Naomi reflected privately, almost easier than open hostility would have been, this careful, practiced avoidance that let both of them pretend the evening's tensions simply didn't exist. Ansh, for his part, approached her tentatively during the cocktail hour, his expression carrying an awkward mixture of guilt and genuine curiosity that Naomi hadn't quite expected. "You look good," he said somewhat stiffly, holding a glass of wine he seemed to be using primarily as a prop to manage his own discomfort. I heard about some of your projects. The mill conversion, that was actually really impressive work. Thank you, Naomi said evenly, unwilling to make this reunion easier than it needed to be simply for the sake of smoothing over 9 years of silence with a single polite compliment. How's the residency going? They exchanged a few more careful surface-level pleasantries before Ansh drifted back toward their parents' orbit, and Naomi understood, watching him go, that whatever guilt he privately carried about his role in her exile, he remained fundamentally unwilling to risk his own standing within the family by extending anything beyond cautious civility. Priya, by contrast, made a point throughout the evening of pulling Naomi into her orbit whenever the demands of being a bride allowed it, introducing her proudly to Rajiv's family, to her closest friends, to anyone within earshot as, "My sister, the architect, she designed this incredible mill conversion you should really look up." A small but persistent act of public loyalty that Naomi recognized, with quiet gratitude, as Priya's own particular form of rebellion against their parents' carefully maintained narrative. It was during the formal dinner service, somewhere between the appetizer and the main course, that the evening's tension finally found its sharpest expression. Naomi's mother, seated close enough to Naomi's table to make her presence felt without directly joining the conversation, made a comment loud enough to carry, ostensibly directed at a cluster of relatives but clearly, deliberately, aimed at Naomi's ears as well. "It's such a shame," Mira said, her voice carrying the particular practiced lightness of someone delivering a calculated blow while maintaining plausible deniability, when someone with real potential decides to waste it on something so unstable. Architecture is such an unpredictable field, isn't it? Not like medicine. Medicine, you always know exactly where you stand. The comment landed with its intended sting, several nearby relatives glancing uncomfortably toward Naomi to gauge her reaction, and Naomi felt the old, familiar heat rising in her chest, the urge to defend herself, to list her accolades and her magazine features and her thriving independent practice, to prove once and for all that her mother's assessment was catastrophically wrong. Instead, she took a slow breath, set down her fork with deliberate calm, and said simply, evenly, "I've been very happy with the path I chose, Mom. I hope you can be happy for Priya today, the same way." It wasn't a rebuttal. It wasn't an argument. It was instead a quiet, immovable statement of peace that Naomi delivered without raising her voice, without engaging the bait her mother had so carefully set. And the effect on the surrounding table was, if anything, more powerful than any impassioned defense could have managed. Several relatives exchanged glances that suggested a growing, unspoken recognition that whatever bitterness Mira Kapoor still harbored toward her eldest daughter, that bitterness was not being matched with an equivalent bitterness in return. Naomi's calm, in contrast to her mother's barbed comment, read as a kind of quiet strength that several guests found themselves, almost involuntarily, admiring. The true turning point of the evening arrived unexpectedly, during a lull in the dinner service, when a distinguished older gentleman approached Naomi's table, having apparently overheard enough of the earlier exchange to piece together the family dynamic playing out before him. He introduced himself as Dr. Sanjay Bhatt, an old family friend and prominent figure within the local business community, someone Naomi vaguely remembered from childhood gatherings but hadn't seen in years. "Naomi Kapoor," he said, extending his hand with evident warmth. "I thought that was you. I read about your firm's work on the old Ridgemont textile mill conversion in the Design Quarterly last spring. Absolutely remarkable project. My wife and I actually toured the completed units before they leased out. The way you preserved the original brickwork while completely reimagining the interior flow, it was stunning work. Truly some of the most thoughtful adaptive reuse I've seen in this region in years." The comment, delivered with genuine enthusiasm and loud enough to carry across several nearby tables, produced an almost visible ripple of reassessment among the assembled relatives. Aunt Divya's eyebrows lifted with surprised delight. Rohan, the curious 19-year-old cousin, actually pulled out his phone to search for the project Dr. Bhatt had mentioned. Even Ansh, several tables away, turned his head toward the exchange with an expression Naomi couldn't quite read. "Thank you," Naomi said, genuinely touched by the unexpected recognition. "That project meant a lot to me. We fought hard to preserve as much of the original character as possible while making it actually livable and affordable for the community around it." "Well, it shows," Dr. Bhatt said warmly. "I had no idea you'd built such an impressive career. Your family must be very proud." The comment, innocent as it was intended, hung in the air with an awkward weight that several nearby relatives clearly registered, and Naomi simply offered a small diplomatic smile rather than correcting the assumption directly. "I've worked very hard to build something I'm proud of," she said instead, a careful answer that avoided the uncomfortable truth without technically lying. But the exchange had done its quiet work regardless, and for the remainder of the evening, Naomi noticed a subtle but unmistakable shift in how several relatives approached her. A handful of cousins and distant aunts drifting over during the dancing to ask genuine, curious questions about her work, her firm, the projects that had earned her that unexpected public recognition. The whispers that had followed her since her arrival hadn't entirely disappeared, but they had shifted register from something closer to pity or scandal towards something that increasingly resembled grudging admiration. The evening's true emotional culmination arrived during the reception speeches, when Priya, radiant in her wedding gown, stood to deliver her own remarks after her new husband Rajiv had finished his. She spoke first about Rajiv, warm and clearly genuine words about the partnership they were building together, and then unexpectedly, she turned her attention toward the family seated around the head table, her gaze settling deliberately on Naomi. "I want to say something that I've kept private for a long time," Priya said, her voice carrying clearly through the microphone despite a slight tremor of nervousness. 9 years ago, my sister Naomi left this family because she wanted to build a life true to who she actually was, rather than who everyone expected her to be. I was 14 years old, and I watched that happen. And I was terrified, honestly. Terrified of what it might mean for my own life if I ever wanted something different than what was expected of me. The room had gone quiet, the particular hush of an audience sensing something significant unfolding beyond the scripted pleasantries of a typical wedding toast. "What most of you don't know," Priya continued, "is that Naomi never actually left my life, even when she left this family. She called me every single week for 9 years. She listened when I was scared about disappointing our parents. She never once told me to rebel the way she did, never pushed me to make the same choices she made. She just kept reminding me over and over that I was allowed to want things for myself, that I didn't have to disappear into someone else's version of who I should be. When I decided to specialize in public health research, instead of the surgical path our parents always assumed I'd take, it was Naomi's voice in my head that gave me the courage to have that conversation with them. When I fell in love with Rajiv, who works in nonprofit healthcare administration rather than clinical medicine, it was Naomi who reminded me that love built on someone else's approval isn't really love at all." Priya's voice caught, and she paused for a long moment, visibly gathering herself before continuing. "I asked my sister to come today because I wanted her here. Not just as a formality, not just because family is supposed to show up to weddings, but because without her quiet, stubborn loyalty over 9 hard years, I'm not sure I would have had the courage to marry the man I actually love instead of whoever our parents might have preferred. Naomi taught me, from 3 states away, more about what real family means than most people learn living in the same house their whole lives. So Naomi," she raised her glass, tears now visibly tracking down her cheeks, despite her clear effort to maintain her composure. "Thank you for never giving up on me, even when everyone else gave up on you." The room erupted into applause, several guests visibly wiping away tears of their own, and Naomi sat frozen for a long moment, overwhelmed by the public acknowledgement of a private loyalty she had never expected to be spoken aloud in front of the very family that had once cast her out. She caught her mother's expression across the room, and for the first time all evening, the polished, rehearsed composure Mira Kapoor had maintained since Naomi's arrival cracked visibly, her eyes glistening with an emotion that looked unmistakably like the first fracture of genuine guilt. The remainder of the reception unfolded with a noticeably altered atmosphere. Relatives who had spent the earlier hours whispering about the family's old scandal now approached Naomi with genuine curiosity and warmth, several openly remarking on how proud her parents must be to have raised 2 such accomplished, values-driven daughters, comments that Naomi absorbed with a quiet, private irony she chose not to correct in front of the wider gathering. It was nearly midnight as the reception began winding down and guests started drifting toward the coat check, that Naomi's father approached her directly for the first time all evening, his expression carrying none of the cold detachment he'd maintained since her arrival, replaced instead by something more uncertain, more visibly conflicted. "Naomi," he said, his voice quieter than she remembered it being capable of. "Could we talk privately? Your mother too, if you're willing." Naomi considered the request for a long moment, weighing 9 years of accumulated hurt against the small, cautious possibility that something genuine might finally be offered. "All right," she finally said, But I'm not interested in pretending the last 9 years didn't happen. If we're going to talk, it has to be honest. Her parents led her to a quiet side room adjacent to the main ballroom, a small parlor typically used for bridal preparations, now empty except for a few stray garment bags and the muffled sound of music still playing beyond the closed door. Mira stood near the window, her earlier composure entirely gone now, replaced by an expression of raw, unguarded uncertainty that Naomi had genuinely never seen on her mother's face before. "I need to say something," Mira began, her voice unsteady in a way that startled Naomi more than any apology could have on its own. "I've spent 9 years telling myself I did the right thing. That strict expectations, discipline, they were meant to protect this family's reputation, protect all of you from struggling the way your grandfather struggled when he first came to this country with nothing. I told myself that if I let one child choose a different path, it would somehow unravel everything we built. That letting you go was necessary. For the family." She paused, her hands twisting together in a gesture of visible distress. "Tonight, hearing Priya speak, I finally understood how wrong I was. You didn't need us to give you permission to succeed, Naomi. You built an entire life, a beautiful, respected career, real happiness, all of it without a single thing we gave you. And the whole time, you were still the one holding this family together in ways I never even knew about, keeping your sister from feeling as alone as we made you feel. I don't know how to reconcile the mother I thought I was being with the mother Priya's speech just revealed I actually was." Naomi listened to this admission with a complicated tangle of emotions, old grief and quiet vindication mixing together in ways she hadn't fully anticipated. "You're right that I didn't need your permission," she said finally, her voice steady despite the emotional weight of the moment. "But I did need your love, Mom. That's what actually hurt. Not that you disagreed with my choice. Parents disagree with their kids' choices all the time. What hurt was that you made your love conditional on me becoming someone I wasn't. That's not protection. That's control dressed up as care." Her father, who had remained silent throughout this exchange, finally spoke, his voice carrying a weariness Naomi had never heard from him before. "I confused love with control for a very long time," he said quietly. "I told myself that pushing all three of you toward medicine was an act of love, giving you the same stability and respect I fought so hard to build for this family. I never stopped to consider that real love might mean supporting you toward whatever made you genuinely happy, even if it wasn't the path I understood or expected. I'm sorry, Naomi. I know an apology 9 years late doesn't undo what we did, but I mean it, all the same." Naomi stood quietly for a long moment, absorbing the weight of these admissions, feeling the complicated mixture of relief and lingering grief that comes from finally receiving words you'd once desperately needed, though arriving nearly a decade later than they might have mattered most. "I appreciate you saying this," she finally said. "Both of you, I mean that genuinely, but I want to be honest about where I actually am. I've spent 9 years building a life and an identity completely independent of this family's approval. I'm not the same person who left that dinner table 9 years ago, desperate for you to understand me. I've made my peace with who I am without needing you to validate it. That peace is precious to me, and I'm not willing to trade it away just because you finally arrived at an apology." She paused, choosing her next words carefully. "That doesn't mean I'm closing the door on you completely. Priya is my sister, and I love her, and I intend to remain part of her life fully, which means, by extension, there will be moments our paths cross. I'm willing to rebuild something with both of you, slowly. If you're genuinely willing to accept me as I actually am rather than who you once wanted me to become. But it has to be built the same way I built everything else in my life these past 9 years. Through consistent action, not a single emotional conversation at a wedding. Words are a start. They're not the whole rebuilding." Mira nodded slowly, tears now falling freely down her cheeks. "That's fair," she said. "More than fair, honestly, given everything." "I'd like that chance," Vikram said quietly. "Whatever pace you need. I understand we don't get to dictate the terms of this the way we tried to dictate everything else." They didn't hug, didn't manufacture some instant cinematic reconciliation that 9 years of hurt hadn't actually earned yet. But something had genuinely shifted in that small side room. A door cracked open that had been firmly sealed for nearly a decade, and Naomi walked back out into the reception feeling, for the first time in longer than she could remember, a strange, unfamiliar lightness settling into her chest. The remainder of the wedding unfolded with a quieter, gentler energy. Naomi danced with Priya during a sister-only song the DJ had been secretly instructed to play, the two of them laughing and crying simultaneously in the middle of the dance floor while wedding guests looked on with visible warmth. She shared a brief, careful dance with her father near the evening's end, neither of them speaking much, simply present with each other in a way that felt, if not fully healed, at least genuinely begun. Her mother approached her one final time before Naomi left for the night, offering not another apology but a small, tentative smile and the simple words, "I'd like to see your mill project sometime, if you're willing to show me." "I'd like that," Naomi said, and found to her own quiet surprise that she meant it. As Naomi walked out of the Winterbrook Grand Ballroom well past 1 in the morning, the cool night air a welcome relief after the emotional intensity of the evening, she paused for a moment beneath the venue's elegant awning, looking back at the warm golden light still spilling from the ballroom windows, the faint sound of music and laughter still drifting out into the night. She thought of the 9-year-old version of the story that had begun at a kitchen table on Larkspur Avenue, the terrible finality of her mother's voice telling her she would leave alone or not leave at all. She thought of the 2 suitcases loaded into a second-hand car, of Elena's steady mentorship carrying her through architecture school, of years of double shifts and grinding uncertainty slowly, painstakingly transforming into a career she was genuinely proud of. She thought of Priya's unbroken loyalty across 9 years of stolen phone calls, of the courage it had taken her younger sister to stand up at her own wedding and speak a truth their family had spent nearly a decade trying to bury. For years, she had privately imagined that success would eventually mean proving her parents wrong, forcing them to see, undeniably, that she had been right to walk away, that her path had been just as valid as the one they demanded of her. But standing there beneath that elegant awning, watching the golden light spill out into the cool night air, she understood, with a clarity that felt like the true culmination of everything the past 9 years had taught her, that proving them wrong had never actually been the point. True success, she realized, wasn't about winning an argument that had ended 9 years earlier. It was about the quiet, hard-won freedom of no longer needing anyone's approval at all, of building a life so genuinely, thoroughly her own, that even her parents' apology, however meaningful, arrived as a welcome addition to an already complete life rather than the missing piece she'd once desperately needed to feel whole. She pulled out her phone and texted Julian, waiting for her back home. "Made it through. It was hard and beautiful and complicated, and I think something actually shifted tonight. I'll tell you everything when I'm home. I love you." Then she looked back one final time at the warm light of the ballroom, thought of Priya somewhere inside, radiant and finally fully free to build her own version of happiness, and turned to walk toward her car, carrying with her not the old, familiar weight of 9 years of exile, but something lighter, something that felt, for the first time in longer than she could remember, entirely, unmistakably like peace. In the months that followed the wedding, the relationship between Naomi and her parents evolved slowly, carefully, marked by neither dramatic reconciliation nor cold relapse into old patterns, but by the steady, incremental work of 2 people learning, belatedly, how to rebuild trust with someone they had once cast aside. Mira did, eventually, visit the completed Ridgemont textile mill project, walking through the converted units with a genuine, unguarded curiosity that surprised even Naomi, asking thoughtful questions about the design choices, the community impact, the technical challenges of preserving historic character while meeting modern accessibility codes. It was, Naomi reflected afterward, the first time in her entire life she had witnessed her mother approach her work with actual curiosity rather than dismissive tolerance. Vikram's path toward rebuilding trust proved slower and more halting, colored by a lifetime of discomfort with vulnerability that didn't dissolve overnight simply because of one emotional conversation at his younger daughter's wedding. But he began calling more regularly, tentative conversations that gradually expanded beyond stilted small talk into genuine curiosity about Naomi's life, her partnership with Julian, the specific creative challenges of her latest projects. Naomi met these overtures with the same measured openness she'd extended in that small side room at the wedding, neither rushing toward false closeness nor closing the door entirely, allowing the relationship to rebuild at whatever pace genuine trust actually required. Ansha's reconciliation with his sister proved, perhaps unsurprisingly, the most complicated of all, weighed down by his own quiet guilt about the role he'd played in enforcing their parents' expectations during Naomi's exile. It took nearly a year following the wedding before he worked up the courage to have an honest conversation with Naomi about it, admitting, during a rare visit to her city for a medical conference, that he had spent years telling himself their parents' decision to disown her had been justified, a story he'd needed to believe in order to reconcile his own compliance with their expectations. Hearing Priya's wedding speech, he admitted, had finally cracked that comfortable narrative wide open, forcing him to reckon with exactly how much he had prioritized his own comfort within the family over any genuine support for his sister during the hardest years of her life. Naomi accepted this admission with the same measured grace she'd extended to her parents, neither excusing the years of distance nor refusing the possibility of eventually rebuilding something genuine between them. "You don't have to have all the answers right now," she told him. "Just keep showing up honestly, and we'll figure out what this relationship actually looks like as we go." Priya and Rajiv settled into their marriage with the particular ease of two people who had chosen each other freely, without the shadow of familial obligation clouding their partnership. And Priya continued building her career in public health research, eventually publishing work on healthcare access disparities that earned recognition well beyond the narrow surgical specialty her parents had once assumed would define her professional life. She remained, throughout all of it, Naomi's closest confidant within the family, the sister whose unwavering loyalty across 9 difficult years had ultimately become the quiet catalyst for reshaping the entire family's future. Naomi's own career continued its steady ascent in the years following the wedding, her firm taking on increasingly ambitious projects, her reputation within sustainable architecture circles growing into something genuinely influential within the broader field. She and Julian eventually married themselves, in a small, intimate ceremony that included her entire family, parents included, a gathering that would have been unthinkable in the years immediately following her exile, but that now felt, if not entirely without complication, genuinely warm and hard-won. Standing at her own wedding reception years later, surrounded by a family that had finally, imperfectly, learned to accept her exactly as she was, rather than who they'd once demanded she become, Naomi found herself thinking back one final time to that terrible night at the kitchen table on Larkspur Avenue, to the 2 suitcases loaded into a second-hand car, to 9 years of building a life from absolute scratch with no safety net beneath her. She understood finally, completely, what she had come to know gradually across those difficult years. That true fulfillment had never actually been about proving her parents wrong, about forcing them to eventually see the value in the path she'd chosen. It had been, all along, about the quiet, hard-won freedom of building a life so genuinely her own that their eventual approval, however welcome when it finally arrived, was never actually the thing she needed to feel whole. She had already been whole, long before that apology ever came. She had simply, finally, stopped needing anyone else to confirm it. There was a particular afternoon, nearly 3 years after Priya's wedding, that Naomi would come to think of as the true marker of how far the family had traveled from that cold September morning on Larkspur Avenue. Her firm had been commissioned to design a community health clinic in an underserved neighborhood on the city's east side, a project funded partly through a public health initiative Priya herself had helped develop through her research work. And the 2 sisters found themselves, for the first time in their professional lives, genuinely collaborating on something that combined both of their chosen fields. Naomi remembered sitting across from Priya at a folding table in the half-finished clinic space, blueprints spread between them, sunlight streaming through windows that hadn't yet been fitted with their final glass, and feeling a wave of something so unexpectedly emotional that she'd had to pause and simply breathe for a moment before continuing the conversation. Here they were, the architect and the public health researcher, the 2 daughters who had once seemed destined to represent entirely separate, even opposing versions of what the Kapoor family could become, now building something together that neither of them could have created alone. "Do you ever think about how different this would look?" Priya asked her that afternoon, tracing a finger along the blueprint's waiting room layout. "If you'd actually gone to medical school like they wanted?" Naomi considered the question seriously before answering. "I think about it sometimes," she admitted. "Not with regret, exactly, more like curiosity. I think I would have been a mediocre doctor, honestly. Competent, maybe, dutiful. But I don't think I would have been happy, and I don't think happiness and mediocrity make for a good combination in a field where people's lives are actually at stake. I think the version of me that exists now, the one who fought for this path even when it cost me almost everything, that version is actually better equipped to build something like this clinic than the exhausted, resentful doctor I might have become trying to live someone else's life." "I think about it differently," Priya said. "I think about how if you hadn't left, hadn't shown me it was even possible to want something different, I probably would have ended up in a surgical residency I hated, married to someone our parents picked out for their credentials rather than their character, slowly becoming a smaller, quieter version of myself every single year until there wasn't much left of who I actually was underneath all that compliance. You didn't just save yourself when you left that house, Naomi. You gave me a blueprint for saving myself too, years before I even knew I'd need it. These conversations, accumulated across years of gradually deepening collaboration and sisterhood, became a kind of ongoing testament to everything Naomi had built, not despite her family's rejection, but through the particular resilience that rejection had forced her to develop. The community clinic opened 18 months later to considerable local acclaim, its design praised for the same qualities that had defined Naomi's earlier work, a deep sensitivity to how people actually experience the spaces meant to serve them, combined with genuinely innovative approaches to accessibility and sustainable operation. Priya's research on healthcare access informed the clinic's operational model in ways that made it a genuine template for similar underserved neighborhoods across the region, and the sisters found themselves, somewhat to their own surprise, invited to speak together at a regional public health conference about the value of interdisciplinary collaboration between architecture and public health research. Their parents attended that conference presentation, seated in the third row of a modest auditorium, watching their two daughters discuss their collaborative work with an evident, unguarded pride that would have been unthinkable in the years immediately following Naomi's exile. Afterward, Mira approached the small stage where Naomi and Priya were gathering their notes, and rather than the polished, performative pride she might once have projected in front of colleagues and strangers, she simply stood quietly for a moment, visibly moved, before saying, "I wish I'd understood, all those years ago, that there was more than one way to build something meaningful. I'm grateful I finally got to see it, even if I understand I don't get credit for helping either of you find your way here." It was a small moment, unremarkable to any outside observer who didn't know the family's full history, but for Naomi, it represented something genuinely significant, not a complete erasure of the pain those 9 years had caused, but a mother who had finally fully internalized the lesson her daughters had spent their whole lives trying to teach her, even if it had taken this long and this much loss for the lesson to actually land. The relationship between Naomi and her father continued its own slower, more halting evolution during these same years. Vikram, now approaching retirement from his surgical practice, found himself with considerably more unstructured time than his career had ever previously allowed. And he used some of that time, somewhat awkwardly at first, attempting to genuinely understand the field his daughter had built her life around. He began reading architecture publications, asking increasingly informed questions during their phone calls, even attending, at Naomi's tentative invitation, the ribbon-cutting ceremony for a mixed-use development her firm completed on the city's waterfront. Standing beside the building that evening, surrounded by city officials and community members celebrating the project's completion, Vikram turned to his daughter with an expression Naomi had genuinely never seen on his face before, something that looked almost like humility. "I spent so many years assuming that because I couldn't fully understand your work, it must be somehow less legitimate than what Ansh and Priya chose," he admitted quietly. "Watching this building come together, watching how it's already changing this whole stretch of waterfront, I understand now how wrong that assumption was. This is real work, Naomi. Important work. I'm sorry it took me so long, and so much loss to actually see that clearly." Naomi accepted these words with the same measured grace she'd extended throughout the years since the wedding, neither minimizing the genuine pain those 9 years had caused, nor refusing the possibility of continued healing. "Thank you for saying that," she told him. "It means something, even this late. I'd rather have it late than never." Ansh's own journey toward genuine reconciliation with his sister took perhaps the longest of anyone in the family, weighed down by a particular kind of guilt that seemed to require more time to fully process than either of their parents' more straightforward regret. It wasn't until nearly 4 years after Priya's wedding, during a difficult period in Ansh's own life when a challenging surgical fellowship pushed him to the brink of burnout, that he finally reached out to Naomi with the kind of raw honesty their relationship had long been missing. "I think I finally understand something about what you went through," he told her during a late-night phone call, his voice carrying an exhaustion that went beyond mere physical tiredness. "I've spent my entire adult life doing exactly what was expected of me, and I'm good at it, genuinely good at it, but there are nights now when I wonder if I ever actually chose this path, or if I just never considered that choosing something else was even possible. You had the courage to ask that question when you were 18 years old. It's taken me until I'm 34 to even start asking it, and I still don't know what I'll do with the answer." Naomi listened to her brother's confession with a complicated mixture of empathy and old, still lingering hurt. understanding that his belated reckoning didn't erase the years he'd spent enforcing their parents' expectations rather than supporting her, but recognizing too the genuine vulnerability it took for him to finally voice this uncertainty aloud. "You don't have to have it figured out," she told him gently, "but I'm glad you're finally asking the question, whatever you decide to do with medicine. Whether you stay in it or eventually choose something else entirely, I hope you get to make that choice as yourself, not as the version of you that was built entirely around making mom and dad comfortable." Their relationship deepened gradually from that conversation forward, Ansh eventually choosing, several years later, to shift his surgical career toward a subspecialty in global health work that took him overseas for extended stretches, a decision that surprised their parents considerably less than it might have a decade earlier, given how thoroughly their own understanding of acceptable family paths had been reshaped by everything they'd witnessed unfold between their three children. Naomi's own life, meanwhile, continued to flourish in the years following the wedding, her marriage to Julian settling into the particular contentment of two people who had built their partnership on genuine compatibility rather than external expectation. They eventually welcomed a daughter of their own, a bright, curious little girl named Asha, whom Naomi found herself watching with a particular vigilance during her early years, alert to any early inclination that might reveal some passionate, unconventional interest, the way her own childhood fascination with buildings and light had first revealed itself. When Asha, at age 6, began displaying an intense, almost obsessive interest in marine biology, filling notebooks with elaborate, if scientifically imprecise drawings of octopi and coral reefs, Naomi felt a fierce, protective determination settle into her chest, a promise she made silently to her daughter and, in some sense, to her own younger self. Whatever Asha eventually chose to pursue, whatever unconventional or unexpected path her curiosity eventually carried her toward, she would never once have to wonder whether her parents' love was contingent on becoming someone other than exactly who she was. "Where do octopi go when it's cold?" Asha asked her one evening, sprawled across the living room floor with a stack of library books about deep-sea creatures spread around her. "I don't know, sweetheart," Naomi told her, settling down on the floor beside her daughter. "But I think that's a wonderful question to spend your whole life trying to answer, if that's what you want to do." Asha looked up at her mother with the particular unguarded seriousness of a 6-year-old considering a genuinely important idea. "Grandma Mira said I should think about being a doctor like her and Grandpa," she said. "But I don't want to fix people. I want to understand octopi." Naomi felt her chest tighten slightly at the familiar echo of her own childhood conversations, though she recognized with some relief that her mother's comment carried none of the rigid insistence that had once defined her own upbringing, more a gentle suggestion than an ultimatum. "You can want to understand octopi," Naomi told her daughter firmly. "That's a wonderful thing to want. Grandma and Grandpa love you no matter what you decide to spend your life curious about. And so do I. So does Daddy. Whatever you love, we're going to help you get there." This assurance, Naomi understood even as she offered it, was not simply a parenting philosophy she developed in the abstract. It was, in every meaningful sense, the direct legacy of everything those 9 hard years had taught her. That love conditioned on compliance isn't really love at all. That a family's true strength lies not in enforcing a single narrow definition of success, but in supporting each member's authentic path, however far it might diverge from expectation. Mira, for her part, had grown considerably more conscious of these dynamics in her own approach to her granddaughter, catching herself, more than once, mid-sentence when old habits of prescriptive expectation threatened to resurface, correcting course with a visible, deliberate effort that Naomi recognized as genuine growth rather than mere performance. During one visit, watching Asha excitedly explain the difference between an octopus and a squid to anyone who would listen, Mira turned to Naomi with an expression of quiet, rueful self-awareness. "I used to think guiding a child meant deciding, ahead of time, exactly who they should become," she said. "I understand now that guiding a child actually means paying close enough attention to see who they already are, and then helping them become more fully that person, rather than less. I wish I'd understood the difference 30 years ago. I'm grateful I finally understand it now, in time to do better with Asha, even if I can't undo what I got wrong with you." Naomi accepted this acknowledgement with the same measured, hard-won grace that had defined her entire approach to rebuilding this relationship, understanding that forgiveness and forgetting had never been the same thing, that healing didn't require pretending those 9 years of exile hadn't fundamentally shaped who she'd become. "I'm grateful too," she told her mother simply, "for Asha's sake, and honestly, for yours as well." Years later, reflecting on the entire arc of her life, from that terrible dinner table argument through 9 years of determined independence, through the wedding that had finally cracked open the possibility of genuine reconciliation, through the slow, careful work of rebuilding trust with people who had once cast her aside entirely. Naomi understood something that felt, in retrospect, both simple and profound. The story had never actually been about proving her family wrong. Satisfying those certain moments of unexpected recognition had undeniably felt along the way. It had been, all along, about the quiet, unglamorous work of building a life true enough to her own values that no external verdict, whether rejection or eventual apology, could ever again determine her sense of her own worth. She thought of her younger self, 18 years old, sitting at that kitchen table with a folder of architecture brochures clutched in trembling hands, terrified of the family's disapproval, but somehow, even then, more terrified of the alternative. A life spent slowly disappearing into someone else's expectations. That frightened, determined young woman could never have imagined the full shape of what waited on the other side of that terrible dinner. The years of struggle, certainly, but also the mentorship that would carry her through architecture school, the career that would eventually earn genuine national recognition, the marriage built on authentic partnership rather than family obligation, the daughter she would raise with a fierce commitment to unconditional love, and yes, eventually, even the complicated, hard-won reconciliation with the very family that had once told her to leave and never come back. The wedding that had once seemed, in the anxious days leading up to it, like it might reopen every old wound rather than heal any of them, had become instead the unexpected hinge point around which an entire family's future had gradually reorganized itself, not into some perfect storybook resolution where every hurt was fully erased, but into something more honest and more valuable. A family slowly, imperfectly learning that love without room for authentic difference isn't really love at all, just control wearing a more comfortable disguise. Standing years later at her own daughter's 6th birthday party, watching Asha excitedly show her grandparents a homemade diorama of a coral reef ecosystem she'd spent weeks constructing, watching her father examine the diorama's construction with the same genuine curiosity he'd eventually learned to bring to Naomi's architectural work, watching her mother offer encouragement about Asha's scientific interests, without a single trace of the rigid expectation that had once defined her entire approach to parenting, Naomi felt something settle fully into place, a sense of completion that went beyond mere reconciliation into something closer to genuine transformation. For years, she had believed that success meant proving her family wrong, forcing them to eventually recognize the value of the path she'd chosen against their every expectation. Today, watching 3 generations of her family gathered around a homemade coral reef diorama, celebrating a 6-year-old's fierce, authentic curiosity about the world without a single voice in the room suggesting that curiosity needed to be redirected towards something more conventionally acceptable, she understood fully and completely that success had never actually required their validation at all. It had simply required her own unwavering commitment to living as exactly who she was, regardless of who did or didn't approve, and everything else, the eventual reconciliation, the genuine growth in her parents' understanding, the family gathered now around her daughter's authentic joy, all of it had followed not because she'd fought to earn it, but because she'd finally, fully stopped needing it in order to feel complete. That she understood now, watching her daughter beam with pride over her carefully constructed diorama, surrounded by a family that had finally learned, however belatedly, the difference between love and control was the truest victory of all. Not the magazine features, not the eventual apologies, not even the slow, careful rebuilding of relationships she'd once assumed were permanently lost. It was simply this, a life lived, fully and authentically, on her own terms, from the very beginning, whether or not anyone else ever came around to understanding why that had always been the only choice that could ever have made her whole.